Yeah.
But maybe you can start by summing up what you think the misunderstanding is, because I'm not fully certain at this point.
I mean, I think part of the problem is that you're trying to limit, well, I don't know if you're trying to limit, but you're looking at this from this perspective of the current use case, and I'm trying to see how this all fits into a bigger picture. There's a couple differences I see. Well, that's one of the things. Another thing is I'm trying to look at it only from like a modeling perspective, and you're looking at it from a user interface perspective. And so you see some things as being important that I see as being unnecessary, possibly for that. But there's a third thing, which is, I think, how do I say it? I don't know. Like, I don't even know. I've said this before, that there's a reason. I don't understand the reason for the contextual claims, what the use cases are for it, and what's going to happen with them. And I also don't see them as being, I said this before, usable, which was upsetting to Marc-Antoine. Yeah, so I guess there's a lot of different areas that.
But what was the last part? I didn't get that. The usable?
Yeah, contextual claim to me is not usable. Because I don't see how you can use it as a supporting argument for anything, because.
Okay, but then first we need to understand whether or not, because I mean, in a way you're contradicting yourself. You're saying I don't see a use for contextual claim, but at the same time you're saying contextual claim is not usable. So I think before we can discuss the letter, we need to see what you mean by what you don't or do understand about contextual claims, right?
Right. I mean, basically my understanding of the use case for a contextual claim is you find in some media somebody else making a claim, and so you want to, or what you believe is somebody else making a claim, right, surrounded by a whole context, which is the book or something else, right? And you want to highlight that thing, and then you want to debate about how that claim, what that claim is, you know, the interpretation. And once that claim has been interpreted, then debate about whether or not you agree with that claim. That's kind of how I see the use cases, right?
Yeah, that's correct, except that that's not the use case of contextual claim. It's a use case of what we have been calling a claim about a claim fragment inference.
Right. But see, I don't see a contextual claim beyond that.
Okay, so that's interesting, because the reason I introduced contextual claim, or working title on the glossary right now is claim about fragment context, is because there was so much disagreement about what the claim fragment inference should be. Like, how do you write it as a claim? Is it should be, can be interpreted as, should be interpreted as, one of the way it can be interpreted as? All of these are different claims. And I would argue all of these are different claims about fragment context / contextual claims. But there's only one. Ideally, well, we might be interested in multiple, but I just wanted to abstract away, because you said something that interested me, that you said this inference claim, a claim fragment inference, or whatever working title is a standalone claim. And I was like, no, I think the whole point is that because they include fragments, because they point to a source, they are inherently not standalone. And that's why I introduced the concept of contextual claim. So we don't have to agree whether it should be, can be, may be interpreted as, whatever the claim is.
Well,
we
yeah,
can just
okay,
talk about any claim that talks about stuff that happens in media sources, essentially.
Yeah. So like to paraphrase sort of maybe the definition, contextual claim is, it's a claim about a fragment, right?
Yes.
That's very overly specific, but works for what we're talking about. And so here, I guess the disagreement is that I think that is a standalone claim.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm pretty adamant that it should be a standalone claim, or I don't understand the purpose and reason of standalone claim, and then we have to go back to that. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, because
So
I
Ken,
think
what
that
is your
a
main
claim.
reason?
Yeah.
What is your main reason? Because in all honesty, from everything I've heard you say so far, I think whenever you refer to it as a standalone claim, it may be, but then I wouldn't call it a fragment. So it might just be the semantics of fragment. But to check whether or not that's true, maybe what is your main reason why you consider it a standalone claim, and an example maybe?
Yeah, so I guess it would have to. I mean, my understanding of standalone claim is and I guess I need to look back at refresh my memory on the definitions, and maybe I just have it wrong on the definitions again. Let me look at
Well, we can check. Just like if you say it has to be a standalone claim, or it is, just give an example and argue why you think it is, and we'll see whether or not it aligns.
Yeah,
Sorry?
my understanding of standalone claim is that it's got all the information you need to understand the claim there. Right.
Can you give an example?
I mean, and there's things that might be immutable about it or not. We have to talk about that sort of thing. But I mean, the simplest examples are things like it was raining on Friday, December 13th, 2013 in Rio de Janeiro. That's a standalone claim.
It is, but is there a fragment in there?
No.
Okay.
But that's a standalone claim as a basis, right? That's something you don't need anything more to understand what you're talking about.
Well, yeah, okay, continue. But just to say, I mean, that's not the key property of standalone claim, because again,
what would you say is the key property of standalone claim?
the fact that it delineates what you should be looking at to understand a shared context. That's what a standalone claim does. It provides a clear delineation between what can be assumed to be shared context and not. That's the key distinction really of a standalone claim. And whether or not that provides you sufficient information to interpret it, that's a different discussion. We already agree that
give me an example of a non-standalone claim that's not non-indexical. I mean, because we know that non-indexical is the, or the indexical is the obvious case that we all understand. Like he did that. Well,
no,
you need to know the context and know who he is.
Yeah, I mean,
there's
right? obvious indexicality that makes it impossible to interpret a claim, and there's indexicality which we can refer to as nuance, I think. And we agree on the nuance use case, and we agree that you can have a fairly abstract standalone claim, but more specificity would be needed because there's nuance, right. And then so we agree on that. But all of these are standalone claims, so it's not that so like one isn't standalone and the other one isn't. I think sometimes you confuse standalone with indexical, and I would argue that
that's
all
what I'm saying.
Claims to some degree are indexical, because there's always some stuff it may be referring to that can be interpreted differently depending on who is interpreting the standalone claim. Now, the point of a standalone claim is that it clearly delineates what everyone that's looking at the standalone claim assumes to be true. If you add a definition to a standalone claim, that definition is included as part of a standalone claim, and everyone interpreting the claim knows it's the same definition we're all looking at. There's no multiple potential interpretations of a definition, opposed to a standalone claim that doesn't have the definition. Still a standalone claim, but the definition is not part of the standalone claim, meaning different people can look at different places to find definitions that suit their argument.
But then I'm not seeing a case of something that isn't a standalone claim.
Contextual claims. The problem is, so if the standalone claim, there is no fragment, there is no link, there is no, so everything the standalone encompasses is the standalone claim. That is a shared context. The problem is with a fragment, there is no delineation of what you should be looking at the hyperlink. Is it only the hyperlink? Is it a paragraph that you can find a hyperlink? Is it the entire blog article? Is it the entire all the blog posts by the author?
But so
there's no clear delineation of what that is a difference.
I don't see that as being a useful difference because
but whether it's useful
To
or
me,
not is
that's
a
just
separate discussion.
ambiguity. That's just another form of ambiguity.
No. Whether it's useful or not is a separate discussion. We can go there, but we understand one is clearly delineated and the other one isn't.
Well, it depends on the well-formedness of the fragment.
But the nature of fragment is that it's not delineated. Everything that's properly delineated, I would call a standalone claim. So now you're
Right,
just
the
moving
nature of the
goalposts.
fragment, no, the nature, you're
moving the
maybe you're
goalposts.
confusing reference and fragment. Because fragment is a reference with some sort of boundaries. And a
The
reference
content
is just a link.
Sorry,
right?
okay. A fragment is a piece of content that appears in media source. The content, the piece of content is clearly delineated. Yes, the media source isn't. Correct? A quote on a website, the text that is quoted is part of the content of the fragment, but the website you're linking to is not clearly delineated. Dynamic content, several posts, indexing.
Well, but but a fragment is something like this URL, third paragraph down, first sentence. That's not well delineated.
The content is. The context isn't.
See, I don't know why fragment introduces context delineation problems and verbal statements don't, because verbal statements are even more fraught with understanding context than a link.
Yes, you can say, look, there's two different ways of, you can even argue that there's a standalone claim that refers to, I mean, I don't think that's useful, but that's essentially what you're doing. Refers to a paragraph on a very specific location. You can formulate it as a standalone, but then it's clear to everyone looking at that anything that's not delineated, like anything outside of the content essentially, is open for interpretation. So it's really a matter of delineating what is.
I
look at it this way.
Like
if you display a contextual claim or a claim of a fragment on different websites, how do you do that? How do users of that website know which parts of the link of the media source they have to look at and which parts they don't have to look at? How does a user know that? And how does a user know whether that's relevant to interpret?
Well, what they have to look at is maybe not the right wording, but you know what the claim encompasses, right? It's in the combination of the words and the link, right? Because the words may describe that pretty clearly. To me, first of all, I think you're coming up with the kind of problem that AI systems might have, but a real human wouldn't actually have
quite the opposite.
Much of it, the problem with that.
Quite the opposite. If you want claim reuse, if you want to have meaningful discussions in multiple different contexts about claims, you reuse and represent multiple places. I'm telling you, they cannot be contextual. They cannot be contextual claims. No, a contextual claim, I'm arguing, can only be used within the context it's being represented in. You can't reuse it. Reusing a contextual claim as a standalone claim would imply that you're essentially having a discussion about that one specific context in a decontextualized way. It doesn't make any sense.
No, I think you're worrying about abstracts and
it's not abstract. This is a real problem, and I've tried to give examples of what was it.
But I haven't seen a problem with any of the examples you talked about. If we talk about the Pepe meme, for example, if we're talking about that case, it's on 5 different blogs, the same image, right? But maybe different URLs because they're copies. There's a problem there with the equivalence classes, but
so what's the goal of the equivalence classes even?
Because you want to say this joke is racist.
The meme only, standalone, right? Not within the context. Correct?
Well, see, now, if within the context is a different claim. If you want to say this person was using that joke in a racist way, that is a different claim, but it's a different standalone claim.
But that's exactly where the distinction lies. Like, one can be discussed standalone. The other one, you need to maybe know that person. You need to maybe know the full history of that person. You need to
look, if you know, person X made a racist joke. Person X made a racist joke. Let's debate that.
You can do that both standalone and
you don't
contextual if it's linking to a fragment in a media source. Both are.
You're just talking about like lack of information that people have, and they can bring that in as arguments, right?
I know we're not disagreeing. They can be standalone claims. I'm saying once there's a fragment involved, it's something different.
I don't understand. I don't see that difference.
I need to find the example again that we discussed.
To me, it's analogous to definitions, right? A definition
has a clearly delineated boundary. A fragment doesn't. And that's something different.
How so?
Well, it depends how you want to represent definitions. How would you include a definition inside of a standalone claim?
Yeah, okay. A definition is delineation is the definition, but it could be a badly written definition. It can be
but it's clear to everyone that it is a badly written definition. Whereas a fragment, it's not clear to everyone what parts of the media source you're linking to you should be looking at. It's not clear what the shared context is. So let me give an example with definitions. Take a standalone claim with a definition of Paris. That's the one I had here. Paris is nice. When there's an encompassed definition of a city in France for Paris as part of a standalone claim, what if people are going to argue, no, Paris did this horrible thing to this other person, whatever, as an opposing claim? It's clear from everyone in any context looking at that standalone claim, no, the definition of Paris is encompassed within the standalone claim. It's a shared, immutable representation. It's shared, it's assumed shared context. Any arguments you're going to make that invalidate that shared, immutable context, like arguing with different definitions, those are simply irrelevant arguments that can be weeded out through curation. Now do the opposite where the definition is a fragment, right? So the definition is maybe a fragment, but in the case of definitions, it's harder. But take the case where, yeah, this meme is racist or something. There is no shared delineated context of what I should be looking at to consider whether or not any arguments I will be making are relevant. There is no shared context because the shared context is not clearly delineated. So is an argument where I argue for or against something based on my interpretation or later received information from that specific context relevant or not? The whole discussion of relevance and the whole purpose of being able to discuss the same claim in different contexts, so outside of the original context where it was mentioned, is gone. That's why I'm saying you can't really discuss contextual claims out of the context within which they happen. That's a big difference with standalone claims.
Yeah, but here's why I disagree with that. You could have a standalone claim debate that is the Pepe meme is racist.
Yeah, you can.
That's it. How do you know if an argument is relevant or not?
At that point, the point is because you know it's a standalone claim, the whole point I'm making is the user needs to know whether they're looking at a standalone claim or a contextual claim. Because it's an overly vague, ambiguous, some argument systems might say, we don't want to support talking about such a vague claim, which Pepe meme. So it's too indexical, so we're gonna reject it as a standalone claim. Others may accept it, and then it's up to them to decide, oh, the Pepe meme, maybe the Pepe meme, it's so obvious that there's only one, so the Pepe meme is not too indexical to understand what the standalone claim is about.
Then you moved it to saying that the problem is being too vague, which isn't a problem with fragments. It's a problem with
no, but you said a standalone claim. We're not talking about fragments now. You said as a standalone claim.
Right, but I don't understand why fragments present a special problem here.
Because different people in different contexts.
Pepe meme, where this Pepe meme is represented, is defined by a fragment.
Yeah. Yeah. So now different standalone claim purposes reuse in different contexts. How are you going to reuse this? That's the purpose of standalone claims, is to be able to reuse them because they stand on their own. You can reuse them in different contexts. If you don't get that part, then so now if a contextual claim like this Pepe meme is racist can be used in different contexts, what does that mean?
I would use it to support or oppose the argument. The Pepe memes are racist. I would say, well, we have debated and decided that this Pepe meme is racist.
Well, but there
Therefore,
might be
at least
disagreement because
some-
there might be disagreement because indexicality there points to a blog that apparently later the author says, oh, but this was pure sarcasm or whatever. It was not intended to be racist. I thought this would
That's
be
part
clear.
of the debate about, yeah, but that's
Yeah,
just
but
changing
now-
the debate of the result of that
Yes,
standalone claim of whether or not that meme was racist, that
Yes,
one
but-
particular instance.
true. That contextual claim can be discussed. I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing to use that contextual claim as supporting claim for something different.
I
How
don't
is that?
see it changing anything. I don't see
It pulls in the full context of the fragments. The supporting claim cannot be interpreted outside
It
of the
doesn't
full
pull it in
context.
except through arguments that are pulled into the debate, supporting or opposing the standalone claim about the fragment. It's the same way it happens with standalone claims. You know, a supporting argument can be later defeated.
With the big difference that standalone claims, you have shared assumptions that you can argue are
I
represented.
don't
and you-
understand. I don't understand what shared assumptions come in that wouldn't need to be stated explicitly. When you're arguing, what you're doing is you're stating explicitly what you might personally consider an assumption, right?
Yeah, and
You're
people
trying to
will
transmit to
disagree.
another person.
People will
That's
disagree.
the nature of debate, right?
But the whole point of claim fragment inference is to say this claim means that standalone claim. I mean, if you're arguing they're the same, you're essentially saying claim inference.
No, that's a
is
different
irrelevant.
thing. That's a different thing. That's a different debate, right?
Okay,
Whether
but
or
if you-
not.
sorry, but if you're arguing contextual claims are standalone claims, then what the hell is a claim fragment inference?
Well, that is something I don't. That's something that I don't know if it needs to exist, right? What it is it's a shortcut to highlighting something in a source and then claiming that that appearance in a source is an instance of this standalone claim.
But you don't have standalone claims. They're all standalone claims. So of another claim.
No, the appearance is not a claim. So you're making a claim that appearance, which is represented by a fragment, that fragment is an example of that standalone claim. That is the claim, right? The appearance is making that claim. That's my claim.
You're drawing an equivalence essentially between two standalone claims, one in a media source and another.
A media source claim is not, to me, a standalone claim. It is a fragment. It is a thing that exists in a media source.
No, sorry. We're not talking about claims in media sources. We're talking about claims about media sources, right?
Yes.
Yes. Claims in media
Yes.
sources, you can easily represent the standalone claims by copy pasting them essentially in a standalone claim and you're done. Correct? Hi, Mike Antoine.
Hello.
Yeah, we're not resolving this issue anytime
We
soon.
can't get past it. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's-
I've actually come to a new perspective on it, which I think probably neither of you will like, but here I am.
Maybe if it gets us out of this.
Of this quagmire, yes.
yeah.
Okay, so let's just make sure we're aligned on basic vocabulary. We have the fragment, which is string of text, and let's say in this case it's a fragment that happens to represent a claim in a media source. For me, the interpretation process is linking the fragment, that is the claim in context, to some definitions or some clauses, paraphrase, that is presumably less ambiguous, clearer, and so on. And Stephen made the very correct argument that sometimes we need to talk about the fragment not considered as being held to have its meaning in context. And the example was some racist statement being quoted in a race studies document, which tries to say this is a racist claim. And then it's not ascribed to the document. So here the statement is taken out of context. But my realization is that if I assume every interpretation is done in context, that means here what we have really happening is the quote is importing the racist statement from another context where it has a certain meaning. Or maybe, and so what you have in the race studies document is precisely an embodied interpretation. That claim taken from this other context, which may or may not be quoted or specified, which is racist in that context, is here being used as a quoted claim, and hence its usage by the enclosing quoting context is not racist because it's studying the claim. And then I realized maybe it's not quoting from a specific context, but it's quoting from, and this is a new concept I came up with, the notion of context abstraction. Like, this claim is usually made in this community at large, or is often made without giving any specific example, without quoting from a specific source, but you're quoting from a range of sources. And then what you have here is the claim in context, but the context is not a precise context, but it's an abstracted context, again, which may or may not correspond to anything real. I'm sure sometimes people are abusively using made up straw man context, but that's another problem, right? So yeah, the notion that it's not about decontextualized claim, it's about quoted claims with an external, quoted from an external context, which may even not be a concrete context, but an abstract context. So that's where I'm at in this.
Get what an abstract context is.
It's saying
it's not a specific media source. It's more like as generally used or something like
in
that.
this
It's
community.
that,
So
yeah.
it's hand wave. It's a hand wavy context. Oh, this community uses this term in this way.
Yeah,
And
that I would actually go as far as to say that's a definition. That's how it should be interpreted.
sure. But what I'm saying is even a definition makes reference to a community, like a dictionary
Yeah.
refers
of
to a
course,
linguistic community.
Yeah, but they take Black Lives Matter, oh, as interpreted by that community. I'm saying for me, that's akin to adding a definition.
Exactly. And I'm fine with that, yes. But anyway, I'm trying to say, I don't know. I'm still I keep saying, do I believe in meaning of decontextualized claims? For me, meaning is always given in context. But it's true that it's not always given in a precise context. It may be given in a kind of more abstract
okay,
context.
but that's true. Meaning is always given in context, and different people have their own contexts. The whole point of standalone claims is to make very clear what the shared context should be, delineating what you should assume a shared context when discussing the claim. That's the purpose of a standalone claim.
Absolutely.
And the only point I'm making is that a contextual claim, you don't have that shared delineation of context you can assume, because there's no line drawn between what can be assumed and not. That's the big distinction. And I'm failing to explain it. Well, I think you get it by now, Marc-Antoine, but it is a big difference.
I'm trying to remember what I wrote earlier, because yes, I do remember we agreed on this very much.
Yeah, not the vocabulary, but we agree on the distinction. And I think sometimes, Timothy, I hear you say you understand the distinction, but then you instantly jump to it's not useful. And I think to make any progress in this discussion, we should first have a shared understanding of a distinction, and then we can once we're using the same vocabulary in terms of there is a distinction, then we can discuss the details of whether or not it's a useful distinction. But I wouldn't try to do both at the same time.
I don't understand the distinction. And I, when I understand it, I think I'm twisting it into my model, and then I go, well, yeah, okay, I see that, but that doesn't help. And so I'm obviously missing this distinction, because anytime distinction is made, I can easily see how that maps into our world of standalone claims, and I see no need or benefit for this other.
But you're a model of standalone claims, or because a standalone claim is pretty much the definition is a shared immutable representation.
Right.
How do you know what is shared, immutable, and how to represent it if you don't know where to draw the line? That's all I'm saying. How
Yeah,
can it
but
be immutable if you're linking to a mutable data source? So by definition, for me, it's fairly clearly not a shared immutable representation.
Well, but then you're just talking about the problem of something being immutable or not.
It is
It's a
part
different
of
problem.
it is
If you're
part of
saying
the
a
problem.
standalone claim, it's not a standalone claim because it's not immutable.
It's
we
part
can
of the
have that
problem because the
discussion,
media
but-
source is also not delineated. And I gave in to Marc-Antoine that the examples I listed were actually really bad because the Nietzsche, Zarathustra, whatever book is fairly immutable and it's fairly well delineated. So in that sense, they're actually horrible examples. The better example, if it would be a contextual claim to Nietzsche, it would be more like, oh, but we don't clearly specify like which are all the books you should consider, etc. And then depending on maybe you quote a book from a specific website that has a they changed the book somehow, they translated and there's translation errors, then it's very important to know that you're not quoting the book, but a specific website version of the book that contains translation errors. That's what I mean by it's very context specific, and there is no clear delineation of what you should be considering when discussing that claim. Whereas a standalone claim,
you know, I see it as being completely analogous to all other kinds of ambiguity. And we solve problems with ambiguity by being more specific, by creating a new claim that resolves the problems of ambiguity of the previous one.
with
That
the
may include
difference
a better
in this
fragment
process,
definition.
with the difference in this process, you draw a clear line between what is ambiguous and what you try to make more specific. You can do that with contextual claims because nobody has drawn a clear line between the shared immutable context you should already consider to be defined or not.
Stephen, what I think you were trying to say, and the example of the quoted meme versus the directly used meme, for me was really revelatory. Quoted usage is fundamentally different.
Try to put it in a claim, right? Let's make an actual contextual claim. So quoted usage would be like this meme is appears on this website. That would be a contextual claim.
Yeah, the example we had was this meme is racist, and here it's about is the usage of the meme by the source indicate that the source is conveying racist ideas and endorsing them, really, that's the point, right? Versus if it's quoting to analyze, of course, it's not endorsing them. And there's a difference in usage in the meme being included as an endorsement, which could also be a quote or not, but, you know, and the source quoting the claim to talk about it, and in that way, the source is already at the level of metaclaims. And the usage of the quoted or requoted or reposted source differs if it's quoted with or without endorsement. And for me, that was I agree, that's a key distinction, right? The quoted versus endorsed, or even just, you know, posed as a hypothesis or posed as a rhetorical device. And there you can get fuzzy between how much is it endorsed, right? Are connotations endorsed? Who knows? That's the dog whistle problem. But there is, when you're quoting something versus where you're directly asserting something, where you're quoting for criticism, these are all different use cases of this claim appears in this media source. And distinguishing them is important. Now, in the case where, let's get back to the God is dead Nietzsche. And this is where I think the idea of concept abstraction is interesting, because we could say, God, you know, Nietzsche said God is dead at this page of this edition of this book and be ultra precise. Or we could just say Nietzsche said God is dead and not specify. And he could have said it in many books. And maybe he changed his mind from this book to that one, exactly. Right? And this is where it gets fuzzy. And the meaning, the interpretation, when you're abstracting, it means, well, we'll have to look over many specifics. And there I agree with Tim. It is a kind of abstraction, abstract, concrete, specific, generic.
Yeah,
Yet,
that use case we have, and it's standalone.
What?
We have that use case. You can create a standalone claim, Nietzsche said God is that. You can create a standalone claim, Nietzsche said God is that in that book. You can create a standalone claim, Nietzsche said God is that on that page, on that whatever. But the difference is really whether or not you delineate that. So we agree on the abstract to specific. We don't need to keep talking about that. We know that is a use case. But if you point to a specific media source, physically, you need to do that through a link concretely on the web, right? If we're going to implement this, that's something entirely different than a standalone claim that's very specific and describes like, oh, in that book, for example, which there still can be multiple editions. And yes, that ambiguity is clearly delineated. That's the distinction. Whereas if you link to specific media source on the web, it's very concrete. And there can be so many context-specific things that are relevant to discuss and how you may interpret the claim about that fragment in that very specific context that become relevant because you're linking to a specific place.
Right. And what I think Tim is saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this distinction between specific and specific, well-defined, immutable, well-delineated is not an essential difference in it may be a implementation difference. We may implement them differently, but it's not an essential conceptual difference between, it's just another form of precision, even if it has a different immutable realization.
Yeah, and then I said it is different because the user needs to be aware about the distinction. So once you understand the distinction, then we can start talking about why the distinction is relevant. Like, how does a user know what this meme is racist? Is there agreement on whether or not the context within which the meme, this meme being a fragment, right? This meme is racist. Is there agreement among everyone discussing that, whether or not the context of that meme should be interpreted or not?
And this is where I think you're putting the boundary of concept shift at different levels. Wait.
Let me pause here to answer that specific question. When you're saying this meme is racist and you're pointing
this meme is a fragment.
Yeah, this meme is a fragment and you're pointing to that specific fragment.
Yeah.
So what you're saying here is you don't know if they're talking about.
What do you think the user will start talking about?
Or that one specific appearance? Is that what you're saying?
What will users start talking about when you have?
You don't know if they're talking about that specific.
Well, no. How does the user know
of the thing, or
how does the user know? How are you going to visualize that?
Know what?
This meme is racist. How are you going to show it?
You show the fragment.
How do you show the fragment?
Is a link, so you click and jump to the reference and see the reference.
So you wouldn't show the content of the fragment in the claim somehow, or?
I would. I think, yeah, you first the content and the link.
How do you render fragments? That's actually a valid question in this discussion, because whenever we say this meme is racist, in my head I have a meme is racist and probably a hyperlink on the picture or something like that.
If it's a fragment, if it's taken to be used in context.
We're talking about fragments now. So.
I mean, that's a question. I don't know. Find the best solution to that problem.
No, but I'm asking you because that's a problem I'm highlighting. I'm
it's the same
you,
thing. How are you going to show? How are you going to show definitions? How are you going to display the definitions? We've never stopped and discussed that. We just assumed it would be a problem we solve and find. Yeah, we assumed that there will be a good solution given to that. We know it's complicated because you need to match the definitions to the words of the statement, and it's not a trivial problem. But we always assume we'll solve that problem somehow, and we don't.
I can give you my mental imagery whenever we talk about this.
I don't need the mental imagery. It's enough
important
to know.
It's important because that's for me why they're distinct. That's literally why a definition is so distinct for me from a fragment. A fragment is a link. You click on it, you go to another web source. A definition for me, all the information to be displayed is part of the standalone claim. So yes, there would be, the actual definition would be there. If you hover over it, you can render it in context, in any context where the standalone claim is displayed. That is a distinction.
Fragments to me are like definitions in that their goal is to reduce ambiguity and nail down what you're talking about. And
they share that conceptually.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so if we don't allow fragments in the system, people will have to make claims like, oh,
I never said
meme that appeared. Wait,
that doesn't strong an argument. I never said we don't want to allow fragments.
I didn't say you did that.
I never said we don't allow fragments in the system. I'm saying contextual claims are different than standalone claims.
But you're arguing about the problem here being that how is it going to be displayed, right? I don't understand why that's a problem.
I was trying to understand. I was trying to make you see why representing a standalone claim to the user should be handled differently than representing a contextual claim. There is a distinction. You're saying we can treat all of them the same. I'm asking you how. That's why I was walking you through the example. How do you display a claim about a fragment? This meme is racist. There's a fragment in there. This meme is racist. How do you visualize it?
You can import the image into the claim if you want to display it there. You can offer the link to jump out depending on how well the fragment is displayed. We might be able to jump to the specific place in a web page. We would have standards as far as immutability, preserving immutability as much as possible.
Immutability of what? Of the content or of the full media source? Mike Antoine and I talked to great extent about like that, and then what part of the media source should be cached, which was a separate discussion. But I would argue, yes, of course, a fragment, the content of the fragment should be immutable, obviously. The media source, I would argue it's impossible to properly cache at any specific point in time, or maybe not even meaningful, because that's it. The whole point for me of a contextual claim, I mean, you can cache it just for hindsight, but the whole point of contextual claim is that you have an ongoing discussion about some content in a specific context, but that context matters, and that context will always be mutable. That's something you have to live with.
I mean, immutability is a problem all its own. And if you're worried about the problem of immutability, that's different.
I'm not.
I don't think that's the point. See, we get a lot of discussions tangled. And immutability is about, yes, it's a special aspect, but it's a special aspect that's important to the base question. There is a difference between telling the user this fragment in this context is racist, and telling the user this fragment in any context is racist.
Exactly.
And that's a user-facing concern. Are we talking about this fragment in this context? Are we talking about this fragment?
That's the problem of ambiguity. And how is that going to appear? You're going to have people making arguments that some people think are relevant and some people think aren't. And you resolve that by saying, no. I was talking about this use by this blog at that moment. And you create
which is a contextual claim.
And what Stephen is saying is that
not a contextual.
No. What Stephen is saying, and I agree with him, ambiguity is it's true. It's a general abstraction that applies to many cases. But the case of contextual versus decontextual case is a special subcase that deserves its own UI. I mean, that's what we're saying, really. It's yes, it's a case of ambiguity, I agree, but it's a special subcase that has its own logic and its own requirements.
And UI, yeah.
Okay, but I'm okay with that. Okay, we want to have special tools for discussing something within a context of something else, right? I've talked about, allow them to make it easier to create new fragments or pull in pieces in other parts of the same thing. For example, are tools you could provide. Sure. But that to me is a layer 2 thing, in the same way that, we could have special tools for logical fallacies. Are we going to have a special logical fallacy thing in the base layer model?
Since you mentioned layers, let me mention this, for me, contextual claims are layer 2 thing, and layer 1 should probably only have standalone claims.
And for me,
Okay,
layer
but
one should only
for
have
me, layer one-
contextual and standalone is a layer 2.
Yeah, but that
No, but you're
depends what
talking
you
about layer
consider.
0. You're talking about the operating system, layer
Yeah,
0
yeah.
or whatever. For me, fragments needs to, as with definitions, needs to be part of layer 1.
Okay, but okay, it's semantics. I was just trying to pointing to layers here, it doesn't really help. I was
Well,
more
but
trying.
except that it does matter in this statement that I've said. I think these special considerations of quote unquote contextual claims is a layer 2 or user interface thing. But for you, the trigger of it being contextual is that it uses a fragment. And I think fragment and you think referring to a fragment in a claim makes it not a standalone claim. And you think layer 1 has to be standalone claims only.
Yeah, because my
And
layer
I
1,
think
because
fragments have to be in layer 1. Therefore, we disagree here. I
Yeah,
think
but
fragments are part of
define
layer
layer
1.
1. When I say layer 1, I mean a layer that only contains standalone claims. So by definition, I don't want contextual
And I think
claims. But
fragments
then
are part
I need
of
to elaborate
standalone
why
claims.
I only want standalone claims in layer 1 for you to understand why I want that. And that's why I hinted at before. I don't, and I talked a bit with this with Marc-Antoine, and that's an interesting discussion to have. I'm not 100% convinced there, but I don't think it's going to be useful to have contextual claims as supporting arguments for standalone claims. The whole point for my layer 1 and why I want all claims to be standalone is because all claims in layer 1 I want to be able to be used in any context. Contextual claims inherently are contextual, and they can only be used in one context, according to my definition of contextual claim. Because you need to know the context they appear in to have a meaningful discussion about them.
Yeah, okay, but let's take a concrete example, right?
Layer 1 is my connecting layer across many different people that use standalone claims. And yes, it's useful to have discussions about claims in context, especially if you're trying to say this context stuff fragment here should be interpreted as a standalone claim. It's actually even a connecting factor, the claim inference or whatever we call it, claim fragment inference. That is a contextual claim. That's a meaningful thing to do in order to derive standalone claims you can then talk about in a broader context, many different contexts.
Yeah, I'm by the way, we had agreed on the importance of the distinction, but I'm certainly not.
Yeah, the use cases we don't necessarily agree on. I know that.
No, basically what you're saying is you want to add, build contextual claims atop of standalone claims, and I want to do the reverse. So there is a fundamental disagreement here. For me, the fundamental unit is the contextual claim, and I'm building standalone as an abstraction of and above.
I think, Marc-Antoine, we tend to agree more than disagree. I think we simply disagree on what built on top of means. Honestly.
No, well, maybe
it's
not.
a modeling disagreement, but conceptually, I think we want to do the same thing.
I'm not sure in this case. For me, the fundamental distinctions are about interpretations, and interpretations act fundamentally on contextual claims.
They do. They definitely do.
And and there we get into what's a standalone claim, right? We did say, yeah, it's considering the claim without considering where it's used. Yes, that's true. I'm still behind that, and it's
and if
great.
That's the definition, it's fairly obvious.
Yeah.
That if it is being used in one specific place, and that's a place you're referring to by definition, almost it isn't standalone, right?
Yeah, and what I'm now saying is, in a way, this corresponds. I spoke of context erasure, and now I'm talking about context abstraction, which is a different thing. Because for me, there's always an interpretative concept. You know, I spoke of it with language markers on strings. I remember we disagreed about that. I speak of it as schema on data objects, schema markers on data objects. There's always an interpretative context for anything. And yeah, but there is such a thing as saying, I'm taking it with the broadest reasonable interpretative context. And the broadest reasonable may be the whole linguistic community. And then you should still say at a point in time, because it only makes sense to somebody who has prerequisite knowledge of a certain era and certain events. So from this time, and when does it stop?
You make the context explicit in a
Yes.
standalone claim.
Yeah, there I agree with you. But this is what and you are right, and I agree with you there, that there is such a thing as giving enough context. So pragmatically, we're not likely to go refer to something else and say, hey, there's missing context to interpret this. But this is a pragmatic decision. There's always missing context.
And we also agree there.
Yeah, I think so.
And there's also a optimal specificity for specific type of discussions, depending on which discussion you want to be having.
Absolutely.
Which point you're trying to make.
Good enough. Exactly. There's a good enough context. We agree on that. But what I'm saying is the distinction between, hey, this context was well-defined, good enough, or well-defined enough is really what we're talking about, versus the context was fuzzy and unclear, and we don't know, not well delineated, which I agree is a real distinction. Is that not a progressive formalization distinction? And in which case is it?
No, but it's again not what I mean by well delineated. You can have ambiguous context that's clearly delineated.
Yes.
And you can have very specific context that's clearly delineated, and you can have ambiguous context that's not delineated, and it's orthogonal.
It's orthogonal, but it isn't. What I'm saying is the delineating the context is one of the axes. I agree there's more than one axis, but it's one of the axes of progressive formalization.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not against contextual claims. Contextual claims probably are the starting point of how you come to standalone claims in the first place. I'm also not disagreeing there. One of the main problems that all my users had was exactly that this is cool, but I mean, it's so inorganic to start talking about standalone claims. It's not how you don't just argue for the sake of arguing out of context. You have a specific in-context discussion, and at some point you want to generalize, bringing a broader audience, and that's when you move to standalone claims. And
there I do agree with you. I think in that maybe let's be again very concrete. In Socrates, you'd have, here's the sentence that represents this argument in this Socrates, in this context, but if you mouse over it, here's the longer definition, so
exactly the full
that it can be reused in many
exactly.
Socrates,
yeah,
and that we know we're talking about the same thing.
Well, except that it wouldn't be Socrates in both cases. It would be one website that talks about one thing, and then the backend might be Socrates.
But
if there's multiple...
no, but in your case, it could be two different Socrates that have two different contextual representations.
If it were a federated
of the same claim, what?
If it were a federated system, yes. And
no, even for non-federated, what I'm saying is it could make sense to say, in this argument, I'll represent this claim in this way, and this other argument, I'll represent it that other way, because the discursive community is different, or the saliency is different, but it's the same claim.
I don't actually store contextual claims in Socrates right now. That's worth
I'm not
mentioning.
speaking about contextual claims. Well, yeah, I am. I'm speaking about contextual expressions right now, of standalone claims.
These are not discussable right now because it's a layer 2 thing for me. But yes, I do intend to at some point store it in an argument system. But just highlighting for right now, making the link is something that I intended for only web authors to use. But then if you have like a second web layer like hypothesis, of course, then you need to have discussion about whether or not these interpretations are correct, and then yes, you would have to add the contextual claims to an argument database as well. But so no, I don't think we disagree there.
Well, I don't understand how, given all this, you can say
because it's semantics. We don't disagree. It's more like we disagree on how we will implement this. And that's why built on top of, we might disagree on what that even means, but it doesn't matter because we don't need to agree right now how to build a system. It's more about understanding requirements.
Yeah, maybe. Tim, where are you with this conversation? I don't know if that helped in any way.
It was like an overview, you know.
what?
It's interesting to consider, you know, the point about whether or not people think standalone claims are interesting to debate.
They are, but they're not. You don't start from standalone claims. You start by reading an article, or you start by.
Maybe, I don't know. I mean, in my experience, I see it also happening the other way, right? Me debating with somebody on Twitter, I would love to just be able to go grab a standalone claim and say, you know, immigration is that, or say this is that. Or
a
that.
claim on Twitter, is that truly standalone? I would say no, because probably is it a reply?
It's not a claim on Twitter. It's not what I'm saying is Twitter is a big mess, and what I want is to anchor it. So what I want to do is say, okay, you know what? You said all these things. First of all,
on Twitter,
is this what you're saying, or is this what you're saying?
But this is context.
Or
this is what Michael Swan and I call context.
No.
When I make an argument with somebody and say, oh, you know, actually, this budget plan isn't going to cost us anything, you know, or you know, universal Medicare will have a net positive impact on your finances, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just typing that in Twitter, I'd rather grab a standalone claim and say, look, right? Just like people pull in arguments, pull in articles. Instead of pulling an article.
Yeah, but all the examples you gave right now, you're having a discussion in context. So,
but he's trying to point. He's basically doing the interpretation thing.
Yeah.
He's like
but from a context
and pointing to.
It's not interpretation.
Claims. No, it's an interpretation. It's you're saying, do you mean this or do you mean that? Which interpretation?
No,
is the right one?
That's asking for somebody to make an interpretation of which one they're trying to say.
Or do you make your own?
But I'm saying making an argument by taking a standalone claim and saying, oh, look at that.
Right? But why are you posting this? Oh, look at that. In response to what or who or?
To somebody I'm debating with.
Exactly.
I'm not denying that we're swimming in context, but I'm not going to record it in the system. That's the whole point of standalone claims.
No, but you're
swimming in your context, like, you know, get your head out of your butt and let's discuss this.
You're having a debate with someone. At some point, you want to, and I would call it broaden the discussion, or you want to find some
or nail down specifics.
Yeah, nail down specifics. That requires not only nailing down a suggested specific, also requires that all parties involved in that specific context, in that debate, to agree on the formulation of the specifics, and that is interpretation. So yes, you can suggest, wait, you said this, can we talk about, do you mean this? That's interpretation. So what do you
recorded in the system is interpretation that is not done in the system.
Yes,
well, right. I would call it done in layer.
It's a mental interpretation activity.
That's why
interpretation is always a human operation. Whether it's recorded in the system is another story.
Yeah,
but it's never made by the system.
It's recording in the system. It's meaningful to record in the system if there's asynchronicity, like you want to be able to have multiple people asynchronously suggest and discuss interpretations, and that's where the whole second web layer, web annotation,
which is claims about interpretation, which it needs to be in the system. That's a separate kind of debate, but it's not how I would use.
Yeah, so you would just post a link to the standalone claim, which is exactly how I've been using it so far, right? I've been posting links to standalone claims.
You agree on much, and even I. Yeah, we all agree on this. We want to.
All I'm saying is that motivation doesn't always start with a claim made in a context that you then have to pull as a.
You don't have to formalize
the system.
We're not saying you have to formalize it, but what you're recognizing right now is that these claims do arise from a specific conversation in context you're having right now.
Yeah,
and it's that context that determines the specificity of your standalone claims that you're gonna.
I never said that wasn't true.
Okay,
I never said that wasn't true.
Then we understand each other.
Yeah, well, you're saying, Tim, I'm a bit confused because you did say it doesn't always start with a claim in context, but your example is about a claim in context. The claim in the original claim in Twitter, you're trying to disambiguate. That's a claim in
No,
context.
it doesn't have to be that's an example, but it could be that, you know, I see people cheering somebody on for something.
Context.
That's a context.
We're swimming in context. There's nothing
Yes.
without context.
But that's the
Yes.
point.
Context brings the motivation for everything. I agree
Yes.
with that. But what I'm saying is
The context
context is
example
not
you're
necess-
looking
wait, wait.
for.
Listen to me. Context is not necessarily a claim. It's not a contextual claim. It's context that we're swimming in. I'm not trying to interpret a claim. I'm taking that context and getting motivated and throwing information out there that are standalone claims.
I think
right?
it will always be claim inference, to be honest. But that's interesting to think about. I think it will always
It could
be
be
a claim-
multiple claim inference. It could be, you know, it could just be, I think this person is a jerk, and I think that probably their belief system is based on things they've heard and never really thought about. And I want to give them one little piece of food for thought that I think will undermine their whole belief system. Right? I'm not interpreting a claim. I'm interpreting a personality and a system of.
Remember, we call
call
it claim inference or something like that. Indeed, and Martin and I had a fairly interesting discussion about what it actually is, what you do when you do what you're discussing right now. And I think what you are
Inferred claims, that's
you are
what Jamie calls
inferring.
inferred
Oh, but
claims.
does this mean, like what you said here? Does that mean that you mean this? Food for thought. Can we talk about this? So that's still in line with the use case that I originally highlighted. I mean, the thing that where you would start from standalone claims would really be that here are all the hot standalone claims that are being discussed right now on this planet, and you see a top 10 of most discussed standalone claims, and you jump in, and then you could still argue, well, that is the context, but it's different. And then arguably, that's when you start from the standalone claim perspective. But typically speaking, yes, there's something in some context that you happen to be in that gives you rise to discuss a specific claim in more detail.
Right. Sure. Real life is the motivation for doing this, right? But sometimes, you know, the standalone claim may come from essentially like a request for information or something. It's like, oh, we've been talking about this, but you know what? Here is a question that needs to be answered.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will just create a standalone claim and go, well, let's figure this thing out. And then we can go back and debate the bigger contextual claim or whatever. But, you know, my part of my point here is that context isn't just claims. It's so much more.
No, it isn't. It's much more.
Yes, there I agree.
Fragments are not claims, by the way. We never said fragments are claims.
No,
Yeah.
that's what we said.
And I'm saying
Fragments
fragments
may
are
contain a
context, but
claim, may
A
infer all
contextual
kinds of
claim,
claims.
you know, one-way interpretation of contextual claim that I gave was, oh, maybe it's a subset of fragments. It's a fragment that someone is asserting is a claim, right?
Which,
Or
if you
makes a
express
claim,
that as a
right?
claim, then you have this fragment is meant to mean, and that is a
Right,
claim.
and that's the point, is
why I
that
call it contextual
interpretation isn't just for claims. You can interpret a word that somebody said.
Of
You can
course, that's why
interpret-
fragments are fragments and they're not claims. Fragments are fragments.
I think
They're just
we
a
all
subset.
agree on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's not problematic. My hesitation is always, for me, standalone is always aspirational. Like we make a claim and we claim it's standalone, or we claim it's standalone enough. And then until somebody points
But for me,
out,
that's not even true, because I mean, I always said like God exists is standalone enough for me, even though that's not specific enough. I want to add God exists as a standalone claim, but I want the system to suggest more specific God exists.
no, yes, that's
standalone
fine.
claims are more useful to discuss.
That's fine. But what I'm saying is, God exists. You say it's standalone, and I'm saying, well, it's. You know, I made the statement earlier. The Earth is flat. If I said the Earth is flat now, given all that I know, it's not the same statement as if some Bushman.
The context is erased. It's not about you expressing it. It's about anyone expressing the Earth is flat.
But I'm saying precisely, it is not the same statement. It doesn't have the same meaning if it's made in two widely different contexts with different.
Exactly.
And so when I'm saying God exists, it is a standalone, I'm putting it out there as a standalone claim.
Exactly.
What I'm saying is I'm actually using a kind of default context, which is linguistic community, cultural community, blah, blah,
The
blah.
broadest possible context that anyone may bring in as context. That's literally what it
Well,
is.
you may be, you're
context
assuming a
that
context and people are going to come in with a
the
totally
assumed
different.
context is what is delineated.
yeah.
Everything within
Yeah.
standalone claims is the assumed context. Anything outside of the clearly delineated context, anyone is free to bring in whatever context they deem relevant.
Exactly.
That's the point.
What I'm saying is standalone context is always assumed context. So there's not, and that's why I keep saying in some way there's no such thing as no context. Anyway,
But I think one other exercise that we didn't finish last time for Timothy to understand it is to go, this meme is racist. And we ended up agreeing that this meme is racist can point to the same meme on 20 different websites, 20 different fragments, 20 different claims, right? And you would argue 20 different standalone claims. Like, what do you do with that?
That's why you create equivalent class, right? It's like, to me, it's again analogous to definitions where you define the same term two different ways. Yeah, you find the same term two different ways, but it turns out the boundaries of that definition are equal, right?
What is the
create an equivalence class?
Yes.
Says these
what
are
is the key?
Definition.
Which representation do all of these share? What is the shared representation of this meme is racist of 20 different websites with 20 different surrounding contexts?
Right. So the problem there
it's not one of them, like we have discussed so far with standalone claims, right? There is no primary relevant presentation.
Okay, here is a very valid, interesting point, which is if it's a fragment that is an image that is embedded in 5 different websites, I think I'm getting now at your ambiguity here, which is are you talking about just the image, or are you talking about where the fragment?
Exactly. You wouldn't draw an equivalence class between contextual claims. That's my point. You draw equivalence classes between standalone claims. It's not meaningful to draw equivalence classes between standalone claims between contextual claims as we've been talking about.
You draw equivalence classes between definitions, right?
As well, yeah.
And that can create an implied equivalence class between.
Okay, we can talk about this. That doesn't matter at this point.
Actually, for me, standalone claims are equivalence classes between contextual claims.
Okay, okay, Marc-Antoine, let me try to say in my words what I think you're saying. You're saying that there's many different interpretations in different contexts. This fragment should be understood as in 20 different contexts, similar to this fragment, the same fragment should be understood as. Yeah. No, not the same fragment, sorry, not the same content. The content can differ, but you're saying all of these 20 different contexts all are talking about the same standalone claim. That's what you call an equivalence class here, correct? I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about the equivalence class between the Earth is flat and the form. What was it? There's 2 different formalisms of expressing.
They're both valid. They're both valid.
Exactly. It's 2 different equivalence classes, right?
They are. But when you say there's no equivalence class between contextual claims,
but it's like, not what I meant. What? I'm talking about like these are 5 standalone claims that all are represented differently, yet they all express the same concept.
But I would include contextual claims there also. Like, let's talk about this one, which is the kind of semantic equivalence class. These things mean the same thing. It's okay to say this sentence used in this context was intended to mean the same thing as this.
But that's one claim.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's one contextual claim, and I'm saying it it's intended to mean the same thing as means it belongs in the same equivalence class as these standalone claims. So yeah, I would include them in the equivalence class.
No,
and I don't see why you
okay,
exclude them.
So do you want to say that this fragment should be interpreted as X, other fragment should be interpreted as X, that these are equivalent?
Well, they refer to the same X, so yeah, they're equivalent.
Yeah, but that's something
refer
different. They refer to the same X. If that's what you're saying, sure, we can say that that's literally what they do.
What I'm saying is the equivalence.
They share the same standalone claim.
What I'm saying is there's a meaning, right, which is itself an equivalence class of claims, and you could start with just the equivalence class of standalone claims, but I'm saying there's no reason not to include contextual claims in that equivalence class of those things that means this.
Well, I would argue it's difficult. Like if you have a standalone claim, God exists, are you going to say that is equivalent to as what? Which contextual claim? Can you give me one example?
Well, okay, let's talk about it. Let's say we have God exists as a standalone claim.
Mm-hmm.
We can imagine another standalone claim in the same equivalence class, which could be there is a prime mover,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that's one that
Yep.
was, yeah. And maybe we could have people who want to split up the notion of all the attributes of God according to Aristotle and say, the Christian God is the combination of those Aristotelian qualities and not these, and some power set of the Aristotelian definitions of God. Prime mover being one of them, final cause being another, blah blah blah. There were quite a few definitions, attributes of God in Aristotle, and then I can say God exists in Thomas Aquinas. This edition, this sentence he was saying the same kind of God exists as this other one that is implied by Aristotle in this specific passage, again, well delineated. I can say, hey, Aristotle and Aquinas were talking about the same God, which I don't believe is true.
That's a different
but
claim
I'm
than
saying,
saying God exists, no? How are these two claims equivalent?
and the abstraction God exists. I can make the claim that these are equivalent, this specific one and the generic one. That's still the equivalence class.
No, but the contextual claim is not the content within the media source. A contextual claim would be, for example, Aquinas wrote God exists in that book, or when Aquinas wrote God exists in that book, he meant that. You can't say that is equivalent to God exists in an abstract sense.
No, I'm saying, no, 1 second. You're speaking about the fragment description, right? There's Aquinas wrote God exists in
that
some
could be a contextual
Theologica
claim.
page,
So which
whatever.
contextual claim do you have in mind?
One second. Let's go through this. We have the meta claim. Aquinas wrote God exists in page whatever of Summa Theologica.
Yes, that's a claim.
That's
itself,
a claim.
and it includes
but that's not the fragment. The fragment
it includes
is
a fragment.
What?
It
refers
right?
to a fragment. It refers to a fragment. But the fragment is the string God exists as quoted from Summa Theologica page, whatever. And I can say that fragment, which is a contextual claim, I think we agree, is...
No, we don't agree. The contextual claim is the whole claim you just said. Aquinas wrote God exists in... The whole contextual claim is the claim. How is it? You're saying that... Do you understand the difference?
You're calling contextual claim the
claim that it refers to a fragment?
The claim of existence of the fragment?
You're saying there's an equivalence clause between the fragments and a standalone claim. You're not saying yes.
Well, that's what I'm calling contextual claim.
That I can maybe agree with, but I can't agree that it's likely that there's an equivalence between Aquinas wrote God exists in this fragment.
I agree totally, because that's the meta claim about the fragment existence, which for me is not the contextual claim. Yes, it's something else. It's the fragment.
How would you name it something else?
I would call that the fragment existence claim, or the fragment.
And how do you call the abstract class of any type of claim that includes a fragment that is contextual? That is what I would call a contextual claim, but okay. Yeah, okay. If you want to say there's an equivalence between the content of the fragment, by the way, because you're talking, well, no, including the fragment, because you want to, and between standalone claims, sure, I can get on board with that.
Okay, okay.
But then we have a word for this, Marc-Antoine, it's a fragment.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
so why
no,
call
it's a
it
fragment
different?
which happens to be a claim.
Yeah, true.
So that's what I'm calling a contextual claim.
I wouldn't, I mean, that's highly convoluted with the current proposed definition if you reread it on the glossary. I agree we can give that a name, but the current definition on the glossary is a claim about a fragment. In what way is the fragment itself a claim about a fragment? You're saying it's a fragment that can be interpreted as a claim. That's something different.
Yeah, that's for me. It's,
okay
I kept seeing the claim in context. I don't know if you remember.
I don't mind calling it claim in context. Yeah, I don't mind calling it claim in context. But just to be clear, that's something different than a contextual claim.
The fragment description. What you're describing, I'd call the fragment description, and it's a claim. There's an implicit existential claim. This fragment exists and it's well described and it's accurate, yada, yada, yada.
That's one of them. It can be anything. We talked about so many different ways of talking about fragments. Should be interpreted as, can be interpreted as, one of the valid interpretations.
And those
fragment is written in source. Fragment is ridiculous. There's so many ways of making claims about fragments.
No, and then there's claims including meta claims about fragments, which is something else.
All of these are meta claims, I guess.
Yes. These are
maybe you want to call them meta claims about fragments. And I honestly don't care what the name. Just there's a clear distinction between a claim in fragment and those.
I now understand there was a fundamental disagreement about what was meant by contextual claim, which could we identify.
Well, reread the glossary definition, because honestly, it's not that vague there, in my opinion. But either way, we need to rewrite that based on the discussions from the past. But I was talking to Timothy why he had this insight where drawing equivalence classes between these types of claims is seemingly something different than drawing equivalence classes between standalone claims. And I think that insight was useful, hopefully, for you, Timothy, to understand why they're different. And I would go as far as to say I wouldn't draw equivalence classes between what Marc-Antoine would call, I forgot the last favorite one, meta, whatever. I call them contextual claims.
So,
oh yeah, we had them there.
The fragment that as a whole can be interpreted as a claim.
Okay, so that's a contextual claim. So, okay, so somehow
that's a fragment. That's very much a claim in context.
Yeah. So it's the other one, but yeah.
And that's how the only way I see a contextual claim. Like it's the only contextual claim I see.
Can you open the one we introduced first, because this one we added after?
What do you first?
The claim about fragment context, the one that I proposed originally, that gave rise to all the new definitions being introduced.
That's totally different. Yes.
So this was originally called at the very beginning when I made distinctions between standalone claims and contextual claims. This is what I was referring to as contextual claim, and this thing still hasn't received the proper name, and that's the thing we're trying to define, and that's the thing I'm trying to define.
I would call this a contextual meta claim, or a meta contextual claim, really, or a meta claim about context, about contextual claim, but meta claim about. But I would call this a contextual meta claim.
I don't care, but this is what the discussion is about, that these are distinct from standalone claims.
Fair. These are, yeah, sure.
And that's what I'm trying to explain to Timothy, and we have agreement on, and yes, we don't have agreement on terminology.
But by the way, their claims.
Wait, what is distinct from standalone claim?
Claim about fragment context was the last name. A claim made about a fragment, which requires knowing about the media source within which a fragment occurs. As such, a claim about fragment is not a standalone claim, since it relies on additional information not contained within the fragment.
Yeah, and that's where I disagree.
So we're talking about this example of 20 different. This fragment is racist, and the fragment here is referring to a meme. on 20 different websites. And then you were
Yes.
talking about how you deal with that. So I'd love to go from there.
No, okay, yeah, I had one important realization about 20 minutes ago, and I've been listening to you guys try to talk about equivalent classes since then.
Yeah, because we sidetracked.
Sorry.
That's why I want to go back to
But
this.
here's the thing, here it is. I understand now exactly a type of confusion that fragments bring that I hadn't realized, and is part of what I think you're talking about, is you don't know what context to consider it in,
Exactly.
which is the image example, right? The image example is a very good example. It's the same bytes, but different URL, right? They're copies
It
of the
can
same
even be
bytes.
different bytes, but smaller, bigger. We
Whatever.
talked about that as well.
Right, but it's, you know, embedded in different web pages, and you make a fragment that is just the image
Well, a fragment's
on
never
5
just
different
image.
websites,
Mm.
huh?
A fragment's
Right.
never just the image.
Well, it is.
It contains
it
the
The
says
image.
where it-
boundaries of the fragment are just the image, just like how the boundaries of a fragment can be just a specific sentence.
No,
right?
no. Read the definition.
Yes.
The fragment is a
It,
subset in a
it
media
includes the
source.
provenance. It
Yes.
includes the provenance in the definition of fragment.
Exactly.
If you just want to say the image,
Right.
then it's the image.
And it's the image. And then you can
Right.
make a standalone claim with just the image.
We can call
Okay.
it the fragment body, by the way, to use
Yeah,
the.
yeah, I like that name.
But that is the fundamental point, is whether or not it's the provenance is part of the context or not. I agree. That's you know, so you don't want that. Sometimes you want to talk about the image and its use in other places, whatever. And so different URLs pointing to different copies of the same set of bytes can be considered the same image, even though they're different, and maybe they're not fragments. If our definition of fragment is includes the provenance, then, but we need to be able to talk about an image independent of provenance as well. So I want something like a fragment for something that
Okay, that's not the
And-
definition of fragment. And yes, I would call that just an image. And if you look at an original definition of
But it's
standalone
not-
claims, why we always argued standalone claims don't have to be text only was because they can include images. Standalone claims can contain many things. They can contain
It would be a
images.
standalone image as such, which may or may not have correspond to a claim.
The key there is you remove the
point-
URL and you remove the ambiguity of what part of the media source you should be
but-
looking at,
no,
which
no,
is the
like-
whole point.
no, but for example, of the video evidence is a huge category of that is important here, which is
Yep.
you know, you may have a fragment that is, you know, seconds 10 through 12 of this video, right? And you want to include the whole video as context, but you don't want to include where the video was posted as context. You just want to look at the video, consider just the video, but the point you're trying to make is in seconds 10 to 12, right? So you have a fragment there, and it's
Yeah,
So-
I can agree on
But-
that, but I would still call the standalone
Okay, but
claims.
now
That's what
going
we're
back
trying to
to-
do. And because standalone claims are supposed to be immutable, it means that there needs to be guarantees in the system to, first of all, delineate clearly what the whole video is you're referring to, as well as a subset within the video. And we can do that.
Okay. But
that's
once
something-
that's done, it to me, it's a standalone claim.
Yes.
It's just a matter of
Yes, agreed.
of-
Agreed.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a
being a
usual
little more
object, not
explicit
a
in a couple
fragment. It's a
places, right.
standalone. Yeah,
right. So maybe what we've defined as fragment is something we don't want in the system because it's got some
Oh,
ambiguities.
we
in there.
want fragments in the system because we want contextual claims. Interpretation claims are contextual claims. That's
Okay,
how fragment was
okay.
first introduced, was
No, no, no.
because there is this.
An interpretation claim is a standalone claim.
So no.
it's a standalone
fragment-
claim about a contextual claim.
If you want to consider
Yes.
an interpretation claim a standalone
Correct.
claim, that
It's a
means you
standalone
need
claim about a contextual claim.
that
yes.
means you need to fully encompass like the context. For it to be explicit, you need to have a fully immutable context you want to include in a standalone claim, as per the definition you just said. In the case of video evidence, yeah, you have the full video you want to include and you want it to be immutable. Otherwise, it's not very shared immutable representation, right?
Uh,
How do you do that with a claim on a website? How do you do that with a claim in an interview? How do you do that with so many things?
No,
Okay, but you reference the fragment, you say there, and then you make a claim about how you're interpreting that thing.
Yeah,
right?
and what's the shared? What do you include?
What's the
what
shared
don't you
context?
include?
Shared context is the sentence within that web page.
Only
it's
that
right there.
sentence. But then, if that's the only thing that's shared, why don't you copy paste the sentence?
no, he said within
No,
within the
it's
web page.
within-
He's
the
delineating
provenance
the
is
web page.
part. Yes, the provenance is part of the fragment, and that's an important part. But that doesn't invalidate it as a standalone claim. It's just that you want it to be considered
Well, it
within
does.
this context of the thing.
It
But
does.
there's so many standalone claims that's like, you know, feminism within the context as interpreted by so and so on whatever. You can do that by words, and you're including a context you want to include in the claim.
Step back
It
from where
doesn't
you came,
invalidate it
because
as
just a
nothing.
second ago you said the full video needs to be included. Now you're saying apparently it doesn't.
No, I'm saying that we need to provide a way to make that distinction. And
Exactly.
the
That's-
image embedded within the web page is a different entity or concept from that set of bytes
Yeah,
visualized.
standalone versus contextual. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Both of them to me are standalone. That's what I'm saying. Both of them to me are standalone. It's just
How
that
did-
one
how do you
version
disambiguate
is the
them?
concept of that. One of them is the concept of that embedded within another context, and the other is the thing interpreted independent of provenance.
Yeah, but how? Okay, so you're saying one and the other, but you're saying they're the same. So
No,
how
I'm
do
saying
I
they're
know?
both standalone claims, but they're different claims. In other words, one is
How do I know which one
This-
it is? Can you give two
you
examples?
you are as specific as you can be, or else you create ambiguity, and we resolve that by creating new claims. So it's this image as used in this blog post is racist, as opposed to this image considered on its own is obviously a racist image, right?
So you want to resolve it by using natural language only.
No, I'm saying we can have a mechanism in the fragment that indicates whether or not the provenance is important, or we have.
And
Which
what's
is
that
what- which is
mechanism?
what
What
Steven
is
was
that mechanism,
proposing.
Timothy?
What?
Explain the mechanism.
One can be reference and the other is fragment, for example. Right? A fragment is a section of something included in a larger thing, in which case the provenance is important. And the other is,
So it's a type of Boolean that indicates whether or not the context is important or not. It can be anything, I'm asking you, but you're saying it's embedded in the fragment somehow.
well, I'm thinking of it, see, I'm thinking about the specific case of the image, right? And I can give a solution for the specific case of the image, but I'm not sure the generic solution. The specific case of the image would be a fragment. You could either do the fragment as the fragment is image 3 located on this web page, right? Or it could be image 3, this URL located in this other URL. So you have a URL for the bigger provenance and the URL for the specific image. I'm not sure the mechanism there,
Yeah.
but then you
So-
could have a fragment that is just this image.
But you agree
the
there's a
URL for this image.
distinction that can be made.
Yes, it's a
Do
distinction.
you
but
agree
I
that
don't
distinction, if you want to make it and show it differently, it needs to be materialized and the system needs to act on that. And the user needs to potentially act on that differently.
The user needs to be made to understand
Okay,
which
how does
one
the user
is-
know what it's looking at if it's not materialized?
It can be materialized. Why not materialize?
Exactly, I'm materializing it through language. I'm saying one is a standalone claim and the other one is contextual. That's all I'm saying. You're just using different languages, saying one
but-
fragment has
Okay,
a Boolean that says should be interpreted as standalone.
Okay, but the difference, well, you are saying contextual claims should not be in layer 1, and that's where I disagree.
We're not talking about layer 1. Let's keep it to the discussion we had.
It is
You're
important
obviously
because you
arguing
are
about
saying you
different
don't want
types.
contextual claims. No, you're saying you don't want contextual claims to be able to support or oppose other standalone claims.
I think
And I'm saying
I think
these
that's
are
getting
perfectly
sidetracked at this
acceptable as
point.
arguments.
we're
It's
getting
not.
sidetracked at this
You're
point. Let's
I don't
consider
see it
your
as a-
model, Timothy. You're arguing there's different types of fragments right now. Yeah, fragments.
or a flag on the fragment, a boolean
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
fragment, or whatever. However,
There's
we're gonna,
something on
yes,
fragment that's materialized that makes it distinct, and you know
Sure.
it's one or the other. So
Correct.
all you're doing is redefining fragments. The latter one, where
Okay.
the context should be included, that's what I call fragments. The
Okay.
former one, where context is not included, that's what I call standalone. Once you get that, then we're aligned, and it's just a matter of finding names for it.
okay.
But you're doing the exact same thing that I've been arguing for the past meetings.
Except that I think you have certain thoughts about contextual that
We can talk about this once we agree that there is a distinction to be made. Right now,
Okay,
you've been arguing to
we're
yourself there
agreed
is a
on that.
distinction.
I
Okay.
don't like the term contextual because I
We
think
can rename it
it's
whatever.
going
I
to
just wanted to
create
make
these
you
conflicts
see
and- yeah.
that, as you express yourself now, that
I
fragment will
totally
contain
agree.
a Boolean-ish.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I recognized finally through that
Okay.
example, which is a very good example,
Okay.
the problem
That's
that
all.
I wasn't understanding.
That's
So
all. We
that
can-
that is cleared up. That's some
Let's
progress.
sleep on this and let's try to come up for names. I'm looking for the way you would model it. It would be for a different name for one fragment versus the other. But because I'm essentially saying a claim that includes a fragment where you would say the Boolean requires you to look at the full context, I would name that a different claim than a standalone claim that includes only fragments that don't require you to having to look at context. Just come up with whatever proposed definitions that are meaningful for you to talk about. But I think it's important to distinguish. Maybe it's two different types of fragments and we can reintroduce a different definition for the fragment. I would be okay with that.
Okay.
Because that's how you seem to think on it about it. But it's worth looking at the current definition of fragment because I mean it always includes context, I think, but maybe
Yes.
I mean we can
Yeah,
change it.
I have to get going.
Okay, perfect. I think we
yeah.
came to some
There
agreement.
was some enlightenment there. There was some clarity
Perfect.
provided. So that's good. All right, guys.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.